All right, folks, that's right. We are taking your calls live tonight at 1-800-466-1873. You are listening to Unchained Radio. My name is Pastor Gene Cook, Jr. I'm the host of Unchained Radio. And we're going to have a guest tonight. We haven't had a guest in a while, but we have a young man who is very courageous, who's stepped up, and he's going to be joining us in just a moment. If this is the first time you've listened to the Atheist Hour, we'd like to welcome you. And we'd like to urge you to subscribe as a user on our website at unchainedradio.com. It is completely free, and the benefit of subscribing on the website as a user is that you will actually receive a weekly update, a weekly announcement, usually on Tuesday around midday, that will explain to you what the subject matter is going to be for both the Atheist Hour and the Narrow Mind. At 6 o'clock, we begin another program that's pretty much just for Christians, but we invite even our atheist friends and our Jehovah's Witness friends, as well as our Mormons and anybody else that wants to listen. But at 6 p.m. tonight, I will begin the Narrow Mind. And tonight we're going to be talking about dispensationalism. I'll continue on my critique of dispensationalism, and so I'd like to invite you to stick around for that. As I mentioned, we have a guest tonight. His name is Keegan Keldson. And Keegan is going to college in Austin, Texas, and he lives in, I guess he lives in Austin, Texas also. He's a young man. He's 19 years of age, and he's going to be transferring to the University of Texas next year. Now, I've never spoke to him. He has, done various postings on our forums at unchainedradio.com, and he also is planning to major in philosophy or English. He was on the high school debate team and participated in the philosophy club. Keegan, welcome to the Atheist Hour.
Thank you, Pastor Gene.
So you're 19 years old, and you're an atheist.
Yes, I am. I guess that kind of started, I'd say around 2 to 3 years ago, I guess, was when I truly realized that I was probably a full-blown atheist. I've kind of been playing around with agnosticism my whole life, and I've always kind of had the mantra of questioning that which we accept in society on face value, and that applied to philosophy, government, worldviews that we, hold and sort of just take on face value. So I've always sort of tried to question, see if they hold true for me. Mm-hmm. And my parents were definitely probably both agnostic when I was raised, and they kind of fostered the idea that I should seek out the answers for myself and not have them impressed upon me. But they both came from Catholic backgrounds. My dad's side is still Catholic. My mother's side has become more agnostic over the years, but I've been to church with my father's side of the family. I've been exposed to, Catholicism, Christianity. I've kind of explored Buddhism, Taoism, some other philosophies like Confucianism, mm-hmm. and none of them really fit that well for me. And I guess it's really because I don't really believe in ascribing to a philosophy that has been laid out for me. I kind of believe in constructing my own worldview as I see it by a collection of ideas and observations that make sense to me. For example, existentialism was a philosophy that I considered, and while some of it, makes sense to me, some of it doesn't. So I take what does make sense to me and what fits with what I see about the world and my existence, and I leave out what doesn't. And no religion I've really explored has shown me a comprehensive, infallible worldview that makes sense in all my facets of life, I guess.
Okay, so you said a lot, actually. My wheels are kind of turning here. It seems to be what you're saying, that is you only grab onto, or you only philosophically lay hold of that which makes sense to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's it. And I guess I believe that that's really what any of us can do as humans. I mean, we have to take what makes sense to us, and if somebody's saying something that doesn't make sense to me, I don't see any reason why I should believe it, I guess.
Now, in your list of worldviews and philosophies that you've examined, you mentioned Roman Catholicism, in that you were, your dad's side of the family is Roman Catholic. But have you ever examined, for example, the Protestant branches of Christianity? I've
done a lot of a lot of stuff. I've never directly been exposed to it. I guess I've never been to a Protestant church. But I've done my reading. I have a few Protestant friends that I've dialogued with, and some people that the philosophy club that I was in, and my high school that I've dialogued with that were Protestant. So I have a good amount of understanding of it, I think.
And it doesn't make sense to you?
Well, no, I don't think the idea of a God that is all loving, omnipotent, omniscient, and eternal really makes sense to me. And the Christian version of this God makes even less sense to me, I would say.
What is it about a God that is loving, omnipotent, and eternal that you find so hard to fathom?
Well, when I look at the world, and I hear about kids who make a life-changing, or actually not life, or even worse than that, a mistake such as driving drunk, or when they get hit by a drunk driver, and they die, or a child in Iraq who's being killed by a bunker buster, or somebody burns to death in a fire. I don't see evidence for an all-loving God. I see. I guess I've never really seen evidence that this being out there is watching out for me.
Okay. Are you a healthy 19-year-old?
I like to think I am.
Have you ever been to the point of starvation?
No.
You have a roof over your head?
Yes.
Sounds like you have a pretty sharp intellect. It sounds to me like he's taken pretty good care of you, in spite of you being his enemy.
Well, he's taken pretty good care of me. There are plenty of other people in the world that he hasn't taken very good care of.
Okay.
People that, you're talking about starving to death. There are plenty of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people starve to death every day.
That's right. There are a lot of people that are starving to death. But have you ever, when you interacted with your friends that were Christians, that were Protestants, did you ever ask them about that?
I'm familiar with the concept of original sin.
Okay, but that didn't make sense to you either?
Well, and I believe you had this discussion, it might have been with Steve Sciani. I can't quite remember. I've been listening to the Atheist Hour for a while now, but it really goes back to the tree of knowledge of good and evil for me, where I don't see how Adam and Eve could have made a moral or conscious decision that they could have been held accountable for if they didn't have a knowledge of good and evil. And I don't see how, even if they could have been held accountable for it, why I should be held accountable for their decision.
Okay. Well, that's good. I just wanted to make sure that you'd actually heard the explanation that we give as Christians. Now, when you call yourself an atheist, there's different definitions that are being offered. How would you define what it means to be an atheist?
Well, I'm not going to define what atheism is for other people. I know there are plenty of I've heard many definitions, such as strong and weak atheism, and agnosticism, all that. And so I'm not going to give a definition for other people. But for me, I would say that atheism would be just a lack of belief in a god or gods, and whether or not that's a positive belief. As in, I know that there's not a God, or a negative belief, or just a lack of belief there. Varies from person to person. Personally, for me, I don't see any reason to believe in a God. At some points, I kind of go back and forth, because it's really hard to, at the end of the day, to prove that there's not a God beyond just, through logic. There's no really way to show with evidence that there's not a God. But I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I lack the belief in gods, and I wouldn't quite say that I know that God doesn't exist, but I would say that it's definitely, I think the evidence is against the existence of a God.
Okay. There you go, folks. My guest tonight, Keegan Kelsden from Austin, Texas, and he's an atheist, and he describes his atheism as a lack of belief in God. If you'd like to dialogue with him, if you'd like to interact with him, our phone number tonight is 1-800-466-1873. That is toll-free, 800-466-1873. Okay, so I'm taking some notes here. It looks like you recognize what has commonly and historically been called the problem of evil, that we seem to have evil existing in this that is loving. Then it's hard for you to comprehend how a loving God or a good God could allow his creation to starve to death and to die prematurely. Am I understanding your position correctly?
Yes, and when you take into account Christianity, the whole hell thing seems a little far-fetched for me too, with an all-loving God.
Okay. Did you grow up in a loving household?
Yes, I would call definitely I would call it a loving household.
Your parents,
I mean,
your parents loved you?
yes, I did.
Okay. And did your parents ever punish you?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Did that mean that they didn't love you because they punished you, or that
Well,
they
no,
weren't loving
but
beings?
I mean, I think you have to take into account what the purpose of punishment is. I think the purpose is to allow the one who is punished to not only learn, but to not repeat that same mistake in the future. And maybe if maybe if you have multiple kids, if you punish one sibling, you're sort of saying to the other one, look what happened to your older sibling. You don't want to do this yourself. So you're sort of setting an example. When I think about hell, for instance, punishment sort of loses its purpose. I mean, you can't, once you're eternally punished, that's it. It's done. And so any learning that you could do from your mistake is worthless because you don't get a second chance. And of course you're not going to do it again, but at what point does it stop becoming punishment and start becoming sadism? I mean, once you're punishing somebody eternally, that is the most punishment anyone can receive. And I don't think that's really justified.
Punishment for the purpose of rehabilitation is kind of a Western concept. I mean, for example, the Bible, the Bible, which is an Eastern document, a Far Eastern document, it doesn't use punishment for the purpose of reformation. It uses punishment for the purpose of retribution.
Is retribution just or loving?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's why it's not. That's why you won't find the prison system in the Bible, because this whole idea of reformation through punishment is foreign to the Bible. One of the most unloving and inhumane things you can do is place a man in a cell for 15 or 20 years. He wasn't meant to be penned up like that. And so, for the purpose of rehabilitation, biblical punishment is retribution, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's not for the purpose of rehabilitating someone. Now, you mentioned something interesting because you said that in a family where you might have multiple children, punishment could serve as a purpose to show others what might follow, if they behave in the same way. Now, that is a form of one of the benefits or purposes of punishment that is used in scriptures. And that's why when they would do an execution, somebody was guilty of a capital crime, they would take him out into the town square and they would stone him publicly so that everyone else could witness that. And they would see that, if you commit this crime, this is going to be the punishment. Now, you can only make the claim that hell is unjust or that it's an unjust punishment if you fully comprehend the magnitude of your offense toward God. And only God, since He's a judge, only God is able to basically set down which punishment is equivalent or just as it pertains to a particular crime. And so the justice of God is not impugned because He punishes people for eternity, because He makes the claim that this is what their sins deserve. Now, you and I are not in a place where we can challenge that, because number one, we don't really understand what it means to be without sin. We don't understand what it means to be holy, and we're not God. We're guilty sinners ourselves.
Well, and I would have 2 points on that. And the first would be that I still can't understand why retribution could be considered loving. And while God may define retribution as loving, that's not what my human sort of intuition tells me is loving. That's not how I've perceived love, as retribution or revenge. And if my perceptions and my emotions and my feelings towards such things, come from God, since He created me, I don't understand why you would give humans this idea of love, which is more of a compassionate or the kind of love that I would consider love would be trying to rehabilitate somebody to make them better if they sin or make a mistake. And I don't see how punishing them could be considered loving. I mean, by its very definition, isn't love and compassion trying to, help others and try and, show them
you're
some,
confusing categories. The problem is here that you're confusing categories. You're confusing love and compassion with the category of justice. Now, I can demonstrate how capital punishment is a very loving thing to do, even though I wouldn't confuse the categories of love and retribution or punishment in the form of retribution. Let me give you an example. Let's say that there's a murderer, and he goes out and he murders the family that lives next door to you. And the law says that if a man does this, he should be put to death. But he happens to be a friend, or he happens to have a contact in the governor's mansion, and so the governor basically releases him from being from undergoing or sitting under the punishment of capital punishment. And after 20 years, he's released again, and then he goes out and kills another family. Now, in that scenario, you can see how it would have been much more loving to have him condemned under capital punishment, which is a form of retribution. So for me, the concept of retribution not only comes out as being just, but it also comes out as being loving. Keegan, let's go to our first call. We have Dustin calling from Greensboro, North Carolina. Dustin, welcome to the Narrow Mind. Or I'm sorry,
Good evening.
The Atheist Hour.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening. Can you hear him
Good
okay?
evening.
Yes, I can.
Keegan, good evening. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are
Doing
you?
good. Great. It's good to have you on the show, man. It's good to hear from you. I just had a few questions for you. Just listening to you and taking a few notes here.
Sure.
You'd said a few things. For instance, that an all-loving, omniscient, eternal, all-omni God, basically, as far as attributes go, it just doesn't make sense. And you gave a couple of examples of what you perceive to be a brutal world, a world that seems to be unfair, given this what you perceive to be this loving God that's supposed to exist.
Well, I wouldn't say brutal or unfair. I understand your point. I would say that the world is not ordered, or that there's somebody looking after me or behind the scenes. I would say that the world isn't necessarily I'm not trying to paint the picture of a world gone mad or a chaotic world, but simply that there's nobody watching over your shoulder trying to make everything all right, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay, now you just said that I'm not trying to paint the picture of an ordered world,
or of a world that is
it just seemed to be a little confusing what you just said. I'm trying to understand what you're getting at. Go ahead, sir.
Oh, that's it. I'm not trying to paint a picture of a chaotic world is what I'm saying. I'm simply disagreeing with the idea that the world is ordered or has some sort of God watching over you. When I see when I hear about somebody getting killed, I'm not necessarily thinking, oh, what a brutal, horrible world. I'm thinking this doesn't sound like a world that is controlled by an all-living being. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Would you consider abortion to be wrong?
No, I wouldn't.
You wouldn't consider abortion to be murder?
No.
So, would you consider that, would you say that one of your major objections to God not existing, or the idea that you believe that God would not exist because the world does not seem to have any governing principle behind it as far as at least the Christian deity as you understand it, because you see so much evil in the world? Would you say that's true regarding what you believe?
Not necessarily evil. I would say more suffering, but yes.
Okay. Now, you had said that you had a background, you said you were interested in Buddhism at one point?
Yes.
And you recognize that Buddhism teaches that the way to remove suffering is to get rid of desire?
Yes, that's a view that I don't necessarily agree with. I explored that idea, but I don't really find it to be consistent.
Yeah. Well, I'm just wondering, in all of this, where do you get this straight stick upon which to measure everything by, given the fact that in an atheistic universe, basically everything's nothing more than molecules in motion operating in accordance with fixed laws. is at least fixed as far as we can determine them and measure them as far back as humankind has measured them.
Are you asking for my...
where's your objective reference point for concept
my take
of
on morality?
fairness, compassion, love?
Are you asking for how I would determine morality, or as an atheist?
Just the idea. I noticed you were talking about it just didn't seem to be quite...
I think I understand what are you asking that since there's no God... I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Well, talking about like the Garden of Eden, you'd specifically brought that up to say it just seems to be unfair that God would hold Adam and Eve responsible, given that they did not have a sin nature and did not experience sin before. How could God hold them rightly responsible when they didn't have anything to compare it to? Was that the argument?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out how, in your worldview, how do you get the idea of fairness versus unfairness?
Well, I mean, we have dictionary definitions of fairness, and the idea that of justice and equality, and fairness would be setting a expectation for in the case of Adam and Eve, setting an expectation for somebody that they are able to achieve. If you set an unfair expectation for Adam and Eve by its definition would be saying, don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, without giving them a knowledge of good and evil to determine that it would be wrong to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I think the same thing holds true for me. Setting, assuming that the Christian worldview is true, I don't think it's the way I would determine fairness is God setting an unfair expectation for me. I believe it actually says so in the Bible that we're not intended to be able to attain what God would consider. Only Jesus was able to attain, according to the Bible, a sinless life, and that we can't attain this, and so we are all sinners, and we are held accountable for this, and yet we are held accountable for something that we can never reach. We can never be sinless, and yet we are held accountable as sinners, and I don't quite see that as fair. But to answer your question, the way that I get that is just that's what seems unfair to me on an individual level. I don't think that you need this higher authority to determine what is fair and unfair, because we have a set definition of fair. We can define fair in our terms as humans. I think a bigger problem would be atheistic morality, which or when it comes to the suffering, which I think in answer to your earlier question, to me it seems like regardless of whether or not there's a God to say this is good or bad, it doesn't make sense that people would be suffering if there is an all-loving God. To me, it doesn't make sense to me, regardless of your take on morality or any of that. If people are suffering and there is an all-loving God, it doesn't reconcile with me.
Well, in regards to that, I still haven't really gotten an answer as to in regards to how you get the concept of fairness to begin with, because you had said that we all basically agree on the same concept of fairness. Well, what was fair maybe to you wasn't fair according to the German in World War II in their treatment of the Jews. They thought it was completely fair for them to be sent to the gas chamber. Hold on, let me finish. You spoke long enough, sir. Let me finish and get my point across so we can have a dialogue. But the Jews were seen as subhuman in 1938. Stalin got rid of several million of his own people in an atheistic regime, and I'm just trying to gather where you get this concept of this universal concept of fairness from, and where do you get a universal from in an atheistic worldview where you can only have particulars that are located to material objects?
Oh, well, I think I said earlier that my definition of fair is my own definition of fair, and that's what our society says is fair. And trying to,
whose society?
Going back to the Nazis,
whose society?
What?
Whose society, sir?
The society that I live in, the Western society. But going back to the discussion about Nazis and Stalin, you can't say that they thought it was fair. The Jews were considered subhuman not because they thought that was the right thing to, I'm sure a lot of the Nazi soldiers thought it was the right thing to do, but they were being deceived by somebody who was doing it to get political gain, to victimize somebody so that they could gain power by having a victim, a scapegoat that they could say was to blame for all their problems. The same thing with Stalin. I mean, you can't. It's really an indefensible position to say that they were doing something morally or fairly. And to ask where I get my definition of fair, it's I hate to say common sense, but it really has to come from the individual. And I'm not going to claim an absolute definition of fairness. If 200 years from now there is a different definition of fair than what I think is fair, so be it. I don't see any reason to have an absolute definition of fairness or morality.
Okay, Dustin, thanks for the call. I appreciate it. You don't want to claim an absolute definition or an absolute morality concerning fairness, but yet you want to say that you don't think God exists because things don't seem fair. Well, and then on the other hand, you just got done saying that the definition of fairness might change in 200 years.
Well, yes, but it doesn't seem fair. I'm sort of speaking from an internal critique. I mean, I would imagine that if God exists, He would give me some sort of methodology within me to determine what's fair and what's not.
Well, you just acknowledge common sense. So if there's no God, then how can sense be common to mankind?
If God gave us common sense, then you would think that common sense would ascribe to the belief that that fairness is God's definition of fairness. And to me, and I'm sure to many other atheists, it doesn't seem fair what happened to Adam and Eve, and it doesn't seem fair to hold us all accountable as sinners. And it doesn't really make sense to me why God would give us a different common sense definition of fair than He has. I mean, I don't think if I say to you, Gene, I want you to I'm going to, throw this ball 20 feet in the air and I want you to catch it, and if you don't catch it, I'm going to shoot you. That's an expectation you can never be expected to reach, to jump 20 feet in the air, or I'm going to shoot you using only, your legs that, God gave you. And if we compare that to the position of God, He's saying, well, look, you can eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and yet I'm not going to give you any method to determine whether or not it's wrong to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
No,
and
He did give them a method.
Mankind falls.
Okay, that's where you're mistaken. He did give them a method, because He not only gave them His verbal word, but He also wrote this concept of morality upon their hearts in the form of a conscience. And so they not only had His verbal word, don't touch it, but they also had their conscience bearing witness that His words were true.
Well, isn't that a knowledge of good and evil?
The knowledge of good and evil that they underwent was an experiential knowledge, not the knowledge that something is evil. Like, you're confusing the two categories here. The knowledge the knowledge that became theirs, a reality at the time that they sinned, was a knowledge by experience. They had God's word. In other words, let's say, for example, God tells me, do not commit adultery. I have a knowledge that adultery is wrong because God said it. But if I go and commit adultery, now I have an experiential knowledge that it's wrong, because I've not only committed adultery, but I've also seen the rotten fruit that comes from adulterous relationships, broken marriages, single parents, raising kids and things of that nature. And so they obtained an experiential nature. Prior to that, they had His word, which is the standard by which we know what is right and what is wrong. So I'm wondering, are you familiar with the concept of grace?
Not in the Christian sense, I guess.
Okay. Well, this is what grace says. You mentioned, you gave an analogy where God throws the ball up in the air 20 feet and He says, jump for it and grab it. And you can't do it. So how can it be fair that God would hold you accountable? You see, the concept of grace is God not acting according to fairness. In other words, God not punishing us for the punishment that our sins deserve. But the concept of biblical grace is the concept of God's unmerited favor in our lives. So God tells us we must be perfect in order to make it into heaven. We can't be perfect because we're all sinners. You and I both acknowledge that. So He sends Jesus Christ to be a representative and die for my sins. Therefore, God's justice is satisfied as He punishes His Son on my behalf. That's called substitutionary atonement. And God's goodness is displayed and his love is displayed at the same time. So he doesn't compromise his justice and he doesn't compromise his love and his goodness.
Well,
that's grace.
Well, at that point, I would start to ask again, why? Why had God orchestrated? I mean, if God is omniscient, he knew that this would happen when he placed the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden. Why would God orchestrate the fall of man only to end it with the death of Jesus, Jesus Christ, his sacrifice? And why it seems awfully I wouldn't say grandiose, but it seems kind of arbitrary to me to have God send his son to earth to do this. Why can't God just remedy it and say, you know what, I don't even need to go through this process of sending Jesus Christ to earth. Why don't I just absolve man of their sins if they believe in me now? Why send Christ, go through this process of sending Christ to earth and having him die for the sins? It seems almost arbitrary to me. Why
because God
doesn't need to do that? He's omnipotent. He can say, I don't need Jesus Christ to do this. I can just say to man, you know what? If you believe in me, he doesn't have to create this Christ figure. He can be the substitute for Christ. He can say, believe in God,
and how would the sins be punished? You see, that would compromise God's justice. God doesn't compromise his justice. In other words, when God forgives a sinner, he doesn't look the other direction and say, "Oh, well, it's okay. Come on in. You can have fellowship with me." Man's sin must be punished. That's why I told you that in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, God is a God that punishes for the purpose of retribution. If you sin, if you violate his law, you must pay the penalty for that. We wouldn't even respect a human judge that didn't uphold the laws of the land by causing criminals to pay for their crimes.
Well, I don't think you're understanding. What I'm saying here is that God can still uphold his law and not need Jesus Christ.
No, he can't.
From the very beginning, which I don't think you answered, is why he even created, put the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden to begin with, or if in his omniscience knew that this would cause the fall of man, why he would cause the fall of man only to give man the opportunity to return to the communion with God through Jesus Christ. Why does God? I guess I'm asking.
Well, I can
why
answer
God
that question.
Needs Jesus to bridge this gap when he's omnipotent.
I can answer that question for you. God had determined in his eternal plan and his eternal purposes that he wanted a creation made in his image to share unbroken fellowship with. Okay? He wanted a people that he would share fellowship with. If he created them solely to worship him, in other words, if he made them so they could do nothing else than worship him, they would have been robots. But he created Adam in his own image and gave him free will. He gave him free agency. And when Adam rebelled, then what God did was he came and he rescued Adam from his sin. And he continues to rescue men and women today from their sin. Now what he's going to do when he returns is he's going to set up his kingdom in the eternal state, and he will experience that unbroken fellowship with countless numbers of people for all eternity that are there, that are loving him because of his goodness and his grace, but are not simply robots in the sense that they were forced, or that's the only way that they've experienced reality. So when we look back, we will see that we should have deserved punishment and damnation. But God in his grace saved us from our sins by sending his Son to be the payment that his law demanded. And in doing so, he upheld his justice, his righteousness, and displayed his love and his mercy at the same time. That's the answer to your question.
Well, why would he go through that process, though, if he's omnipotent? Why can't he just plant these thoughts, these ideas that we deserve damnation, but that he saved us through his mercy? Why can't he somehow transport these ideas into our head through his omnipotence?
In other words, you don't like God's plan, and if you were God, if this scenario was true, and you were God,
going back to things making sense to me, it seems rather inelegant to me for God to do this.
How would I understand God's mercy? If God is a merciful God, how would I understand God's mercy if he had set up the plan the way that you suggest?
Because, omnipotence suggests the power to do anything. God can give you all of the knowledge that you would have attained through experience by simply granting it to you through his omnipotence. He doesn't need to actually have you experience it.
It would be
he
artificial.
Has the power to do anything he wants. He could have you think you experienced it, not experience. God doesn't need to go through this whole long process of creating Jesus Christ and all that. Or even.
So what if he chose to? What if he didn't? What if he just chose to do it the way he did? What's wrong with the way he's doing it?
You're
saying it's too much.
Inelegant.
Oh, I don't like it because it's inelegant. It's too much work. I mean, it's too involved. I mean, why would he go through all the trouble? That's not an argument against what God has done. That's just Keegan saying I don't like the way God did what he's doing. Let's go to our next caller. We have Sam calling from the East Coast. Sam, welcome to the Atheist Hour.
Hi, Jane. I just would like to ask your guest a couple of questions. He said something I really have no idea what does it mean, and he repeated many times. He said, it's true for me, that it seems to me. I don't know what he means by it's true for him.
Keegan?
Well, I don't believe that they're... let's just assume for a second that there is no God, and we have to discover what's right for ourselves. In my worldview, I would say that you can't really have an absolute, I guess. You can't really know the truth. So you kind of have to determine what seems true for you. I mean, we do it every day. I mean, psychology teaches us that what we see, what we perceive, isn't what's really out there. I mean, when images go through your eyes and go back into your occipital lobe, they're upside down, they're covered in veins, they're full of holes, they have lenses over them, but your brain sorts that out and perceives it in a certain way so that it makes sense to you. And so the way I see things is
talking about how you perceive things. Your perception doesn't change reality. So if you're talking about it's true for me, and that's how I perceive it, that's different from saying there isn't any truth out there. You might say I don't know it, but I'm hearing you saying there isn't any truth absolutely true.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to say there is or there isn't, but even if there is some sort of absolute truth, I don't think we'll ever be able to determine what that truth is. So claiming something as the absolute truth for me would be arbitration, because we will never know whether or not that's really truth. And so claiming it as truth seems to be a fallacy to me. And all we can really do is sort of say, well, look, this seems most likely to be true for me. This has always worked out in my life. This makes the most sense to me. This I've seen evidence for. This is what has worked time and again, and that's what seems true for me. And I mentioned existentialism earlier, and it's a very existential belief, and that's probably the most important thing that I've taken away from existentialism, is that you kind of have to figure out what is true for yourself, because you don't have anyone else's experience. I will never know what it's like to be, say, Pastor Gene Cook Jr., because I don't live life through his eyes. I don't see things as he sees them, and I'll never be able to understand what it's like to be Gene, and likewise, Gene will never understand what it's like to be Keegan. So, and from that, I can take away that I, as Keegan, have to determine what's right for Keegan, because I'm not going to, know what anyone else is experiencing beyond myself.
All right, Sam, thanks for the call. I appreciate it. Now, you speak in terms of universal rightness, universal truth. Do you believe that there is something such as universal truth?
There could be. If there is, I do not know what it is.
So when you say that I have to figure it out for myself, in so many words, are you an empiricist then? I mean, do you
Yeah, I would say I'm an empiricist, but to some extent. I mean, the way I see things is that reality sort of trumps logic in my mind. If logic tells us that people don't fly, and then I see somebody flying, obviously either logic has failed or I have failed to understand logic in the correct way. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I kind of live through my experience, and I use logic to a degree, but I would say I'm pretty empirical. So
you use logic. As in an atheistic worldview, where does logic come from?
I'm not understanding the question.
Well, you speak as logic as some type of entity outside of yourself. You appeal to logic, you use logic, and I'm wondering where does logic come from? The concept of logic.
Well, for one, I would ask why all things have to come from somewhere, for one, and for two, logic. I think you're speaking of logic as if it's this tangible thing, and it's really not. We've come to understand logic and written it out, in our language that we understand, verbally and writ. But logic really exists as, I would say, just how things work in general. I mean, I'm finding it hard to explain this because it seems to me that logic is not really this entity, and I'm sorry if it sounded like I was explaining it like that. I see logic more as a just sort of the rules for our existence. That everything has rules, and we've come to call them logic and write out the laws of logic and fallacies and the law of axioms and non-contradiction and stuff like that. But when it comes down to it, that's just our understanding of what, quote, the rules are.
Okay, but the rules obviously are greater than Keegan, right? They exist. Whether or not Keegan existed, the rules would still be there.
Oh, sure.
So where do the rules come from?
Well, why do they have to come from somewhere, I guess, going back to my original question?
Well, if they're going to be binding on all men, in other words, if you're going to expect me to reason logically, I'd like to know why I'm expected to reason logically.
Well, because...
I mean, maybe this is just something that you made up.
Well, no, because, I mean, by anybody who... Logic is used in all facets of discussion. If you're trying to sort of prove that logic isn't supreme, you're using logic to disprove logic, which is a self-refuting argument. And the same holds true from what I've debated on the Unchained Radio forums. A lot of people use the presuppositionalist argument, and to even use this argument that God is the highest authority, they're acknowledging logic as the highest authority because they're using logic to prove that God is the highest authority.
Not unless logic it exists and flows from the mind of God.
Well, I mean, that's one way of seeing it, but wouldn't God have to ascribe to the laws of logic as well?
And by the way, presuppositionists don't appeal to logic; they appeal to the Word of God.
Well, I mean, you're using logic to state. I mean, logic. We're using logic. We would be using logic right now if we were having a discussion about soccer. I mean, you use logic to communicate. Without logic, people would be walking into walls, totally confused, unable to communicate. We're using it by even just dialoguing with each other.
But in an atheistic worldview, in an atheistic universe where everything, as Dustin mentioned, is biology in motion. That there's really, I mean, we're just bags of biological matter. I don't see how concepts such as logic find a place in that type of a world. Well,
I mean, as I believe Dustin also mentioned that these in motion as scientists try and measure these and find the rules of these, and these atoms and molecules and bags of biological material. Because they are also governed by logic. I mean, I don't see why logic has to come from the mind of God, I guess.
Well, because if you don't say that it comes from the mind of God, then you won't know where it comes from. Well,
and then we go back to my original question, is you're assuming that maybe not everything, but that logic is, or these concepts have to come from something, which I don't believe to be necessarily true.
Well, you're just saying that there are some rules out there that guide us that we have to follow. Well, I can't tell you where the rules come from. They're immaterial. In other words, we can't see them. We can't experience them empirically.
Well, I think we're experiencing them empirically right now, just by our very existence.
What five senses did you use to experience logic?
The senses that tell me logically that your voice that I'm hearing on the other end of the telephone is, coming from a man, because I've, in the past I've.
Now that's my voice. That's not logic.
Because I've in the past, the voice always comes from a man and not some disembodied entity that lives in the telephone or something like that.
That's not logic. I'm talking about the law. Well, let's say the law of non-contradiction. Let's talk about the law of non-contradiction. Which of your 5 senses did you use to acknowledge that the law of non-contradiction exists? I mean, can you show me, through my 5 senses, the law of non-contradiction?
No, I can't, though I can induce that the law of non-contradiction exists. So
you don't know all things empirically?
Well, I mean, I'm using my mind here. I mean, I'm basing, in a way I am, because I'm basing this on what I've seen and heard and experienced in the past, to induce that what I've seen and heard and experienced in the past will somehow give me some reason to believe. Well, because these things have been true in the past, will also be true in the future, I guess, through induction.
Okay, let's go to Doug calling from Wichita. Doug, welcome to the Atheist Hour.
Hey, Gene, long time, first time.
All right.
I just wanted to, I had something, I think you said, I just wanted to clear it up, but you said that God wrote morals on our hearts. Is that what you said?
Yeah, That's what Romans...
Humans said humans have free will?
I think Adam had free will. I think that Adam basically plunged the human race into bondage to sin, as it says that we are slaves of sin. We have free agency, but that's not the same as free will. We act according to our will. We make decisions, and our will acts according to our nature.
Okay, because it just sounded like if God wrote the morals on our hearts and we have free will, that's a contradiction in terms right there.
No, I would say that we are free agents. That is, that we act according to our nature.
As God created us with free will, right? Unless we certainly sometime evolved a free agent gene and lost our free will gene. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what happened, was Adam was created with free will in the sense that you're using it. But when Adam rebelled against God, he plunged himself and the human race into condemnation, and therefore they were no longer morally neutral. They were sinful.
Okay, can you give me that free agent thing in the Bible?
They were sinful by nature. Well, I can give you the concept that all men are born in Adam, and therefore they're all born sinners. They're all condemned, Romans 5:18. And I can show you from Romans 2:13 and 14 that all men have the law of God written on their hearts, and their conscience either excuses them or accuses them.
Okay, because when you were arguing free will and stuff like that, because you're asking to call it a question, and if you don't believe anybody has it, what's the point of asking them that?
I'm sorry, was that a question? Or
yeah, that was a question. I had a question mark at the end of it.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part. Can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, sorry, I'm on a cell phone. Because you were asking about free will, so I thought you were making a case about his moral stance. If he had free will and stuff, you didn't even bring up the free agency part.
Well, I was referring to Adam when I was talking about free will.
Okay.
I said God made man with free will. Adam, speaking of Adam, and when man disobeyed, then God rescued Adam from his free will decision. So man is no longer free in this. Jesus says, whoever sins is a slave to sin. And so I agree that we make choices, but our choices are compatible with our nature, and we're sinners by nature. Therefore, we will never choose God or that which is perfect or right without God's assistance.
Okay, so we're blameless because it's part of our creation. Okay, that clears it up.
No, we're not blameless. We're responsible.
Well, absolutely. We were created that way because of God created us with sin. So yeah.
No, God created Adam without sin. We are the procreation of Adam. We're not the immediate creation in the sense that Adam was.
Well, can I interject here?
Who created the sin then?
Sin is not something that's created. Sin is the absence of that which is good.
Okay, so something out of nothing. Okay, I got it.
Well, it's like the concept of cold. Cold is the absence of heat, right? There's not an entity known as cold. Cold is the absence of heat. In the same way, sin is the absence of that which is good. Darkness is the absence of light. Okay?
I think your guest was going to say something.
Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, well, something about what you said earlier, that we were born, that Adam was born sinless, and that was since we were procreations of Adam after he sinned, that we are now sinners, which to me doesn't make much sense. I mean, if my father's a doctor and he procreates me, does that make me a doctor because he chose to be a doctor? I mean, what does that mean? Well, I don't understand the argument that because Adam sinned, we are all sinners because we are his procreation.
Oh, I tell you this: if your dad has blue eyes or brown eyes, you think you might have blue eyes or brown eyes?
But those aren't choices that he made. He wasn't born with brown eyes and then chose blue eyes, and then because of that I have blue eyes. He was, in that scenario, was born with blue eyes, I have blue eyes. That's different from the Adam Eve scenario.
Well, if God brought about a curse and he said, after your choice, now your eyes are going to turn blue, then, and everybody's eyes are going to be blue, then everybody's eyes would be blue. So the analogy is that when God commanded Adam and Adam disobeyed, he was brought under God's curse, and therefore all of his offspring are under his curse.
So
that's why we need to be born again in Christ. We're born once in Adam, and we're born under condemnation. God sends a second Adam, the person of Jesus Christ, who dies for our sins and mediates between God and man. Now that's not fair. That's called grace.
Okay, you said he cursed them, therefore he was removing the goodness, therefore he created this situation where sin was, so he still created the sin.
Well, if you want to think of it that way, that's fine. But you guys are asking me.
I don't believe all that garbage, but that's what you're saying. Yeah.
Well, you might not believe it, but I'll tell you right now, without even knowing you, you're a sinner, right? You violated God's law.
No, there's no God. There's no law to violate.
You've never committed a sin?
Well, as your definition, no, because there's no God.
So then, what is your definition of sin?
Storybook.
What is your
being as that character?
So. Don, I would love to talk to you for an hour. Are you available? Or I'm sorry, Doug, are you available next Tuesday? I'd like to have you on so we could explore this idea of there not being any sin. So if you're interested, give me a call back, okay? Or send me an email.
I'll send you an email and we can talk about it.
Yeah, okay.
About whether or not I want to rearrange my software or something that day or something for it.
All right. Thanks, Doug.
Okay.
Here's the thing, Keegan. You're asking me for these detailed explanation about God's plan that I'm proposing. I'm saying, this is what the Bible says. This is what reality is. And you ask for these detailed explanations. And yet when you say that we all use logic and there are these rules, I ask you, well, what about that? How does that work? And you're saying, well, it's just self-evident. It's just there. I mean, I don't have to know where it comes from. You wouldn't accept that from me. If you said, Gene, how did God create Adam? And I said, I don't know. He's just there, or why did God do this? And I just said, well, it's just the way it is. Would you accept that for one moment?
Well, no, but I think that the difference is that we can see logic at work in our everyday lives without question. And whether or not you want to, you can sort of, manipulate and say that, well, we see God at work, through us. And I mean, that's just, you're choosing to call it logic so you can create something that I have to account for. And really, I'm not really seeing logic as this a thing that you can grasp at. It's really sort of just this property, I would say, of the universe. And I don't think I explained that very well earlier, but I would call logic more of a property of the universe than anything else, because I really don't see any reason for it to have to come from somewhere. And the reason why I would accept logic and not God is because I don't see any evidence that God is at work, whereas I see much evidence that logic is at work, because it's a property of the universe that I see every day. I see logic in me communicating with you right now.
So you believe you believe in logic, which you describe as a property in the universe. You acknowledged earlier that it's an immaterial property. Has logic always existed as a property of the universe? Is it eternal?
Sure. I mean, if the universe is eternal, then I would imagine that logic would be too, unless, I'm not going to claim that to have all the answers here. I mean, there might have been a time when logic didn't make sense, and where logic was backwards, or there was no logic at all. I don't know, or when there wasn't even a universe. I don't claim to know the answers about the birth of the cosmos. But and the reason why I don't ascribe to the Christian viewpoint of that is because I haven't seen any reason to believe that take on the beginning of the universe.
Okay, and So you believe in a immaterial set of rules that are eternal and they're properties of the universe. But you'll accept that, which you have no explanation for where they came from, or how they came into being, and yet when we offer an explanation for not only existence of logic but for the existence of Keegan in the person of God, you reject that because you say it doesn't make sense.
Well, I see no evidence for it, whereas I do see evidence for logic, and we do it every day, really. I mean, there are plenty of things that I don't understand exactly where they came from, or I don't understand completely, but I know that they're at work. For example, quantum physics. I recently saw physicist Dr. Brian Greene give a lecture down at AMD, and he said, one of the statistics he cited was that about 60% of our modern inventions were a direct result of quantum physics. And so, I mean, we see these things like quantum physics or logic that we don't maybe understand where these concepts come from, but we see them at work, and they're evident to us that they're at work. Whereas God, I have seen no evidence that He is at work, and this explanation, and saying that God is an explanation for logic, you would have to first give me some reason to believe that God is that explanation for logic, just as if I were to say that there is an all-powerful unicorn that's controlling everything that's the explanation for logic. You would ask for some sort of explanation for that, too.
All right. Well, I'm wondering what kind of explanation will suffice. If God the Christian version of reality is that God existed, He made man in His image, He gave him the ability to reason, ergo the laws of logic, and then calls man to be reasonable as he approaches God's word. That's a nutshell explanation. What's wrong with it?
Well, I think it would be reasonable of God to give us some sort of reason to believe in Him.
Oh, He has.
Well,
He has, because
if
if
you
you don't,
cite the Bible or God's word, I don't see a reason to really believe the Bible, because God has never spoken to me. He's never revealed Himself to me, and in my experience, I don't see any reason why I should go beyond what I've experienced or what I know to be true to believe in something or take this leap of faith as Christians do. I don't see any reason to do that.
Christianity, first of all, does not teach a leap of faith. Christianity is not fideistic. Christianity is faith that's based on reason. Okay, and when I say faith based on reason, see, I can give you a reasonable explanation for the existence of the laws of logic. I can give you a reasonable explanation for the origin of man. And you reject those things and you say, it just doesn't make sense to me. I'm going to hold on to the existence of man, and I'm going to hold on to the existence of a property of the universe known as the rules, even though I don't know where they came from, how old they are, or anything else about them. But that just seems to make more sense to me. That's essentially what your argument is.
Asserting something without evidence, I can also refute it without evidence.
The part that you're missing about transcendental apologetics is that God is a precondition for even the request for evidence.
Well,
how can you, as an atheist,
you're ignoring that point, though, that you have to start from somewhere, and since I haven't started from the presuppositional apologetic, I don't see how I can get to the presuppositional apologetic without some sort of evidence.
Well, here's the deal. My axiom is God. Yours is logic. But my axiom accounts for both of our axioms. Yours doesn't.
Well, now you're assuming again that logic has to come from somewhere, and by that very notion, I could ask you. I mean, your axiom has flaws too. Where does God come from? I don't think you can claim to understand God. The idea of an omnipotent, omniscient, eternal being is actually rather vague. We don't. I mean, we've attributed 3 or 4 properties to this being, but we actually don't know much about it. And I've met, several Christians. Most theists will tell you that we can't claim to understand God or His plan, and saying that, God has this plan that we must follow, but then, saying that we can never truly understand God because of our minds are finite.
All right, we're out of time, Keegan. You're hearing the music in the background.
Yeah.
We're up at the top of the hour. Hey, I enjoyed the dialogue. Let's talk again later, okay?
I did too. Thank you very much. Okay.